homeless being put back on the streets. Today, we're going to talk about the proposed cuts and try to better understand the impact of the NOFO changes on the region. Katie Barnett, who is the manager of Civic Leadership Strategy for All Home, will first provide an overview of the HUD COC changes. Katie will be followed by Marisa Espinosa from our research team, who will then walk through data on the funding gap across our 9 counties. Our colleague Joanne Karchmer will then facilitate a discussion with Chris Cabral, who will give us a view on how things look in Sonoma County. And Vivian Wan from Abode will join us, and she's been involved in this topic seemingly pretty heavily of late in Alameda, Napa, and Santa Clara counties. Just a couple of meeting notes. The meeting recording is going to stop when we have open discussion. I'm sure you're all aware we're living in interesting times, and so we will pause it when we have open discussion, but we will record when the presentations are happening. And then we will have clarifying questions after Katie's presentation. And when we get to open discussion, if you have a question, just kind of normal Zoom protocol, please raise your hand or put your question or comment in the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to Katie.
Thank you, Ken. Okay. Next slide. Thank you. So HUD's Continuum of Care program exists in every region. There are 44 of them in California. They exist to provide structure to our homelessness response systems and also designed to be incredibly adaptive. So any given continuum of care can be structured quite differently from another. There are precious few things, in fact, that are generally the same one to another, but one of the biggest pieces relates to this last program goal point here, which is about providing funding to local efforts by nonprofit providers. And that is the COC NOFO, which is a federal funding stream that is a tentpole to every COC. Next slide. So there are approximately 3 different housing solutions that are funded through the COC NOFO. Permanent supportive housing, which does not have time limits and is exclusively available to individuals with a disability or households that have a member who has a disability. Rapid rehousing, which is more of a short-term subsidy, and joint transitional housing / rapid rehousing. There's also transitional housing on its own, which has largely been phased out. Next slide. There are 2 different components to the Continuum of Care NOFO competition. A local competition, which is local individual projects that are evaluated by each continuum of care using HUD criteria and also some locally determined criteria. And then there is a national competition between all continuums of care where they are evaluated by HUD on specified criteria related to system design, governance, and policies. Both processes use a scoring rubric and result in a ranked list. This scoring criteria has always been used by HUD to guide best practices. Next slide. Locally, this results in a ranked list that looks something like this. HUD calculates the amount the continuum of care needs to keep its projects fully funded and sets typically around 90% of that aside as a kind of safe harbor. Projects that are in that top portion of the ranked list are virtually guaranteed to get the funding that they're asking for. Tier 2, the bottom portion, is not at all secure. Projects that are placed there are competing nationally, primarily on the basis of how high the COC they are a part of ranks in that list. Next slide. So next we're going to look at some specific changes that were rolled out in this NOFO that was just released in November and then has now been pulled, likely to be re-released soon. Next slide. Oh, wait, previous slide. There we go. Thank you. So the protected funding in Tier 1 was capped at 30% of annual renewal demand, as opposed to 80 to 90%. All other projects then have to compete in the national COC competition. Any unfunded renewal projects represent a permanent loss to the total amount that a continuum of care can apply for in subsequent competitions. Next slide. So, and we're going from something that looks like this to, next slide, something that looks like this, as in the vast majority of existing projects in any given community are imperiled. Next slide. So this applies to, so in tandem with that, there's also separately a 30% cap on how much of any given continuum of care award can go towards permanent housing solutions, a phrase that encompasses all three of the different types of housing that we just saw on an earlier slide. Overall, most continuums of care spend about 90% of their awards on some combination of those types of housing. The only exception in this NOFO to that 30% cap on permanent housing is for transitional housing projects. That may or may not carry over when the NOFO is reissued, but it's safe to assume that some aspect of it will. Next slide. So the COC NOFO is a way in which HUD sets priorities when it comes to how we approach homelessness interventions and solutions. And there are several changes that this rolled out that we can go ahead and assume will be present in subsequent rounds of the NOFO competition, in part because the text of this NOFO drew authority for much of this from Executive Order 14321, Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets, that was issued back in July. Next slide. So their new priorities include mandatory participation in supportive services. That can include things like employment training, life skills training, on-site substance use treatment programs at least 30% of the projects within a COC, and conditional sobriety requirements. These are some of the more specific and actionable ways that HUD is forcing compliance with its new stance on harm reduction, which is completely against it. This is largely baked into scoring criteria, and by tying expectations to a point system that is in turn tied to the purse strings, communities and individual projects essentially need to comply in order to remain competitive and have any hope of receiving or holding on to a decent portion of these annual millions of dollars in funds. Next slide. One of the stranger aspects of the now pulled NOFO is the explicit awarding of points to continuums of care that happen to exist in regions where there are municipal and state laws banning the realities of unsheltered homelessness, such as camping within city limits. That is, of course, completely outside of the control of any given continuum of care, so this one may not, in this form, carry over into the reissued NOFO. However, past NOFOs have rewarded continuums of care for advocating against the criminalization of homelessness, so we don't know for sure. Also, new outreach services funded this way are expected to directly involve law enforcement as part of outreach teams, as well as having specific dedicated seats for law enforcement on continuum of care boards that set local priorities and policies. Next slide. A significant departure from past NOFOs are these poison pill requirements that grantees are now expected to sign in order to receive funding if they are awarded it. These include promising not to facilitate any activities that relate to addressing racial inequity, gender affirming services or care or language, or essentially any harm reduction services. Further, there's now an expectation that they must contractually obligate themselves to comply with any data requests from law enforcement pertaining to immigration status or citizenship. Next slide. Next slide. So where some of this is a little bit murky in terms of immediate impact, some of it is not. This is the far and away largest aspect of this that we all need to grapple with very quickly, which is a looming funding gap. This is going to start in early 2026. I believe regionally, the earliest will be March when it starts to hit. But as awards from the 2024 NOFO start to be spent all the way down, there will not be the renewed source of funding there until at the earliest June of this coming year. So anything funded through the annual renewals of the continuum of care NOFO cycles is suddenly going to find itself lacking that essential source of funding. This also will impact private landlords due to the fact that some of what is funded this way include tenant-based subsidies, scattered site units, etc. This is going to impact every community for, at the very least, 3 to 4 months. Next slide. This again is one of the pieces of this that was pretty shocking to see in the NOFO, and we don't know if it will carry over into the reissued form or not. But HUD is now claiming the authority to be able to use past activities as criteria to reject or modify awards in current and subsequent rounds of the NOFO. Then that determination can now be based on information in pieces of media, as well as complaints that are found to, quote, have merit. The critical hinge here is whether or not individual projects or continuums of care themselves have engaged in activities that are contrary to the priorities found in the NOFO or the current era HUD priorities. So again, that's anything related to racial equity, gender affirming practices, etc. Harm reduction as well. Next slide. Mandatory service participation and conditional sobriety are completely at odds with California's Housing First law. This raises a lot of legal questions that we have yet to make sense of, but state-funded homelessness interventions must comply with harm reduction practices and simply cannot adhere to both sets of requirements. Since receiving continuum of care NOFO funding requires a funding match, there's a lot of combined pools of funding that keep most of our housing interventions afloat. So this is more of an existential challenge that we collectively must grapple with. And I believe that is the end of the slide portion. So let's take those down. And if there are any questions at this time, happy to answer them. I'm not seeing any, so I believe I will hand this over to my colleague Marisa, who's going to speak to the data implications of this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. Do we mind getting those slides back up on the screen? Great. Alrighty. So, hi everybody. My name is Marisa Espinosa. I'm the research manager here with All Home. And I'm going to be talking about some of the data, adding some context to the NOFO information Katie just provided, and providing some additional analysis of how this impacts the region. So as you see here, this is one of our maps as a part of this presentation. This one is focusing on highlighting the estimates for funding and beds that are likely to be lost as a result to changes to the NOFO that Katie just described. And this is based on HUD data compiled by the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I believe Joanne linked this resource in the chat, and you can download that data from them as well. This map is showing what results from the new 30% cap on funding for permanent housing that we were just talking about. We definitely want to emphasize that these changes are a floor and not a ceiling. Actual loss is likely to be higher than estimated. So you can see our 9 counties here in the Bay Area. The colors represent the percent of the total COC award that is projected to be lost. But then above each county, you're actually seeing the dollar amount that's estimated to be lost, as well as the resulting number of permanent housing beds. Across the Bay, we're estimating a loss of at least 125.3 million in permanent housing funds and at least 7,104 permanent housing beds. Next slide, please. So next we have data from the Turner Center that delves into the potential impacts to tenant-based permanent housing beds. I want to give a big thank you to the Turner Center for this data. I think Ryan's here. Thank you, Ryan. Here we're talking about the number of permanent housing beds that are not site-based. They are subsidies or housing assistance being used in the private market, and this includes both permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. So again, we have our 9-county map, but this time the colors only represent the number of tenant-based HUD-funded COC beds across each county. We're estimating at least 5,959 permanent housing beds that are tenant-based, which is 56% of the HUD COC-funded permanent housing beds in the Bay Area. And what we're pointing out here is how the NOFO's impact not only creates a funding crunch for local governments, we're likely to see, as Katie mentioned, knock-on effects for private landlords in the region as well. Next slide, please. And now, since the NOFO policy changes essentially prevent local agencies from pursuing racial equity goals, we feel it's important to remind this group of the glaring racial disparities among who experiences homelessness in the region. So just to make sure we're all on the same page about what these disparities look like across the Bay, we have 2 maps. This first one shows disproportionate representation of Black and African Americans across the population experiencing homelessness. So again, we have our 9 counties, but this time there's a disproportionality rate on each county. It's a number representing the representation or overrepresentation of a racial or ethnic group among the population experiencing homelessness. As you can see in the little white box, the number of 2 would mean that a group is observed experiencing homelessness at 2 times this proportion of the overall population. And on average across the Bay, Black and African Americans are overrepresented among those experiencing homelessness by 3.9 times, so almost 4 times. Next slide, please. This slide has the same structure, but it conveys the disproportionate representation of Native American and Indigenous people among people experiencing homelessness in the Bay Area. And I just want to note, we know that there are significant disparities among other racial and ethnic groups as well. We just chose to highlight these 2 for now. So again, we have our 9-county map, and we can see a varied range of impacts across the Bay with these disproportionality rates for each county. On average, across the Bay, Native American and Indigenous people are overrepresented among those experiencing homelessness by 3.1 times. The important takeaway we want to emphasize here is that the NOFO changes would not just create a funding gap, but also worsen existing disparities among people of color. So as many of you know, this type of policy can create an atmosphere where jurisdictions, community partners, and other leadership, they become reluctant to pursue racial or ethnic equity goals. And this is already so often work that goes overlooked, despite how this data should compel us to do the opposite. So in this moment, we think it's important to encourage you to consider how we can innovate and level up our work in this area. We want to leave you with a couple of questions. One is, how can we collaborate to address these disparities in our work despite these restrictions on racial and ethnic equity work? And how do we strategize for this next chapter considering these changes to the NOFO? And so before turning it over to Joanne, I just want to see if there's any questions from the group. All right. I'll go ahead and pass the mic to Joanne.
Thanks, Marisa. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to put a pin in what Marisa just said.